Chapter 15. The End of This Story and the Beginning of All Others. Akira considered the offer before her. Power and knowledge beyond all possible comprehension would be hers for the taking. Once Akira combined the powers of her four patrons with the power taken from the end of the cycle, she would be one of the deities of the Shroud, a titan among gods. All-powerful and all-knowing, Akira would be able to reduce the universe to atoms and remake it in her grand design. This was the key. All she had to do was accept whatever terms were offered. Somehow, in complete defiance of the incredible difference in scale between herself and the end of the cycle, Akira managed to communicate her willingness to accept the offer, which still stood. The omniscience and omnipresence of a god would belong to Akira if only you bring forth the end. She hesitated. The end? What did it mean by that? Akira assumed it was referencing the end of time, the moment when she expected to depart this universe and move into the next. As soon as this concept appeared in her mind, two forces rose to correct her. The Whisperers in the Void and the end of the cycle made it clear to Akira, in no uncertain terms, that the end was, in fact, the total annihilation of everything. Not just the Earth or the solar system. Not just the galaxy, but all galaxies. The universe itself. The vastness of the multiverse beyond would fall silent. Without the energies of normal space to sustain them, the realms of hyperspace, the Shroud, and the unbidden domains beyond would eventually succumb to starvation and perish. It would be the final ending. The period at the end of the last sentence in the history of existence. On the other side, there would be nothing ever again. It will be the end. Akira flailed about in her mind, desperate to find some loophole, some way out. This wasn't what she wanted. She wanted to carry on, go past the end of time and back to the beginning. How was she supposed to do that if the whole of space-time was snuffed out? Once again, the Whisperers in the Void provided the answer. There is no loop. The end of the cycle commanded Akira to look down. Infinitely far below, she could see the physical plane. At its command, she understood that her knowledge of time was flawed, for she had studied time from the inside while she was experiencing it. Now, from her heavenly vantage point in the Shroud, Akira could see time itself, isolated from physical matter. Causes and effects came together and mixed like two channels meeting to form a stream. A stream that only flowed in one direction. Akira finally understood. Time was neither a loop, nor was it a straight line, but a winding, meandering progression that moved inexorably forward, never turning back on itself. What she wanted to do, to loop back to the dawning of history, was just not possible. This discovery should have broken Akira. She had come so far, sacrificed everything, and left her whole world behind, radically and irreversibly transformed her own body and soul. And now, Akira discovered that this was all for naught. For her efforts, she was being offered the opportunity to do the dirty work of some god of destruction. Akira's emotions, amplified by the Shroud, grew into a mighty thunderstorm before ballooning out into a hurricane. In an instant, Akira made up her mind. The torrential storm of emotions parted as she reached out one hand towards the monster. The end of the cycle extended one gnarled, ghoulish appendage. As it reached out to Akira, the hand-like structure at the end of the appendage burst into bright blue flames. Akira and the end of the cycle grasped one another in a gesture that just barely qualified as a handshake, and the blue fire raced up Akira's arm, stopping just short of her elbow. There was no pain. Only these words were spoken. Bring forth the end. Akira, her body shining as brightly as a newborn star, ascended to the peak of the shroud. She knew what she had to do, and she acted quickly, so as to keep her mind clear of all conscious thought. Akira gathered her own powers, now augmented by all 5 of the Shroud patrons. She siphoned energy directly from the end of the cycle. Each moment she spent gaining power, Akira felt the Shroud grow dimmer and quieter. Thunder and lightning roared around her as the hurricane of Akira's intentions grew into a cataclysmic maelstrom. Time itself was so diluted and warped around her that she could have stood there on the summit of the multiverse for a few seconds or a few centuries without being affected by the passage of time. Then, when the range, scope, and scale of Akira's powers reached a peak of omnipotence, she raised her right hand and clicked her fingers. In an instant, too fast to acknowledge or react in any possible way, all intelligent life in every conceivable universe was simultaneously snuffed out. Anything that was even capable of rational thought simply blinked out of existence, leaving behind whatever psionic energy was contained in its conscious mind. On Akira's command, the shroud parted and allowed her to step into the physical realm once more. She stood on the ruins of the Angel Moon, high above the world of Higara. This had been the biggest cluster of sentient life, and thus the biggest well of psionic energy. Akira gathered all of this energy into herself and rose. She absorbed all of the emotional energies of the people she had just wiped out and became the Reckoning. From one planet to the next, star to star, galaxy after galaxy. Ultimately, the boundaries between universes were rendered meaningless. The Reckoning could neither be halted nor delayed. What life remained tried to flee. Spaceborne creatures fled to the dark spaces between galaxies, only to be hunted down one by one. How long this extermination took is irrelevant. What does time matter to an eternal being? Soon enough, the stars grew dim. Galaxies faded and were lost from view. Where once there was light and warmth and color, there was now only the inky black. It wasn't even cold or silent. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Without intelligence and emotion to sustain it, the shroud began to starve. As the psionic energy that made up the place was drained, the strange and fantastic beings that lived here perished as well. Ethereals flickered and faded. The strange lands built from emotion lost their features before vanishing completely. Before too long, the end of the cycle would be left to contemplate its own demise in a barren and empty world. As the final protons decayed away, what was once a vibrant multiverse of limitless possibilities was left a formless and silent void. At long last, the end of the cycle was triumphant. It had finally accomplished what it had been seeking to do since the dawn of time. just as it had predicted, the mortal girl's foolish quest to seek out the beginning of time had instead concluded with the destruction of both space and time. The end of the cycle, now satisfied, settled in and began to wait for the final ending. It waited and waited. And then the realization struck like the beam of a pulsar. Time still existed, and it was still passing. Seconds ticked by and became minutes. An hour was adding up. The end of the cycle finally realized that the destruction of everything was not complete. And in that single moment of doubt and disbelief, the illusion came crashing down. Like a shattered pane of glass, cracks opened up in the surrounding darkness before falling away. A dark sphere surrounding the end of the cycle on all sides shattered apart and revealed everything. The shroud was still intact, the universe unharmed. Everything, from the moment when Akira had snapped her fingers, was an elaborate illusion, a hoax. And the girl herself was gone. Roaring so loudly it could be heard in the unbidden realm, the end of the cycle set itself upon the pursuit. Akira was only a short distance away from the Archangel when she heard the roar of the incoming monster. She knew the illusion was broken and the end of the cycle was coming. Scarlet, Inez, and Ingrid raced out to meet her, daring to brave the strange properties of the shroud. "Akira, something's coming our way," Ingrid said. "How do we get out of here?" Scarlet cried, her face full of terror. Inez pointed to the ship and said, "I can't get the engines to light up, but the time core seems to be fine. Don't think we want to try jumping in this place, though." Akira's face lit up. She had an idea. "Have you started charging the module yet?" "What? No," Inez replied. "We don't even know where we are or how we can... Wait, what are you doing?" Akira had pushed past Inez and pointed one of her hands at the Archangel. A pulse of telekinesis hit the ship with such force that several of the thermal protection tiles broke free. Two things happened at once. In the cockpit, several buttons were pushed of their own accord, while an invisible force typed a command into the hyperspace core computer. A serene, computerized voice spoke out loud, saying, "Hyperspace core charging, ready to jump in 8 minutes." The second thing that happened was a sudden burst of movement from the boarding ramp. A metal contraption flew through the air towards Akira, and she grabbed it in both hands. "What's that thing?" Ingrid asked. "Isn't that the bend brace you got from Site X?" Scarlet asked. "That thing's gotta be over 100 years old. There's no way it still works." Akira ignored them both. She needed to focus and only had a short window of time. Of course, Scarlet was right. This thing was, in fact, a Venn brace. It was a piece of 1960s-era XCOM technology that was once used to capture and imprison an ethereal being. The actual device was in the cuff, meant to be worn on the wrist. The brace drew power from the backpack, which contained a miniaturized Elerium core. When she first took it from Site X, Akira had been planning to rebuild the Venn brace into a psionic weapon, but had never found the time. But now, Akira had nearly godlike powers, and that kind of issue was a thing of the past. She knew she had roughly 60 seconds until the end of the cycle was upon her, yet in that time she could get so much done, and a plan was starting to come together in her mind. Akira drew from the vast knowledge granted to her by the Whisperers in the Void. She perfectly understood the Venn brace at a glance, and instantly knew how to repair and improve upon it. With but a wave of her hand, Akira used the Composer of Strands to restore the Venn brace to full working order. Now she had a weapon to channel her powers through. Akira put her right arm into the metal cuff and locked it in place. Then she strapped the power cell across her back. The metal surface felt cool against her shoulders. In the distance, the end of the cycle erupted forth from the Valley of Shadows. Its power preceded it, as all of the terrain and psionic life in the monster's path was laid to waste. Scarlet, Inez, and Ingrid all looked from the gargantuan monster to Akira, their faces flushed with terror and panic. "It's coming!" Inez screamed. "What do we do? What do we do? What do we do?" Scarlet cried. Once more, Akira turned to the Whisperers for answers, and in less than a second, she had one. It was a callous answer, an evil answer. But in the grand scope of things, how evil was this going to be, really? Akira knew far more about the nature of existence now than ever before. She understood that her three friends were, in the cosmic sense, as insignificant as a speck of dust, and to insist otherwise would be a futile effort. In Akira's plan to rewrite history, Scarlet, Inez, and Ingrid were not only pawns. They were pawns that are both expendable and replaceable. Once Akira reached the next timeline, these three would exist again. So, as far as Akira could tell, there was no harm in getting the maximum amount of usefulness out of these three right now. With just 30 seconds until the end of the cycle arrived, Akira turned towards the trio and unleashed a torrent of psionic energy upon them. Scarlet, Inez, and Ingrid all screamed and wailed in agony as their bodies and minds were transfigured and transformed. The composer of strands molded their bodies into new shapes. The Whisperers in the void carved and whittled at their conscious minds. The Eater of Worlds implanted the talents and abilities of psychic warriors, while the Instrument of Desire erased all of their hopes and dreams to replace them with new ones. In just a moment, Ingrid Siajotso, Scarlet Freeman, and Inez Vasquez all ceased to exist. And in their place stood three identical copies of Akira Robinson, complete with her memories and her psionic powers. At the command of the true Akira, all three of her doppelgangers turned to face the oncoming threat, and the end of the cycle crashed headlong into 4 overlapping shields. Keeping her arm raised, Akira cast her mind back to the Archangel. The computer screen in the cockpit said, "Hyperspace core charging, ready to jump in 7 minutes." The end of the cycle smashed its way through the telekinetic shield, and the battle began. The 4 Akiras scattered and laid into the monster with all of their powers. The titanic Lovecraftian beast lashed out in all directions and met stiff resistance. Soulfire, as bright and hot as a newborn star, poured down the creature's back while invisible swords lashed out at the extremities. The shroud around them changed to reflect the ongoing conflict. Swirling clouds of blue and purple gathered around the scene to form a cataclysmic hurricane. Each of Akira's copies used her powers to bend the storm to their will, striking the end of the cycle with extensions of the shroud itself. The true Akira used telekinesis to lift the Archangel into the storm and allowed it to be caught by the cyclone. Gliding in a great circle around the end of the cycle, Akira commanded the spaceplane to restart its engines. The Time Core needed another 5 minutes. The end of the cycle recovered and took the initiative. A wave of strange energies rippled away from the monster and hit all 4 of the attacking Akiras. The true Akira lost her balance and fell, disoriented. A high-pitched scream caused her to look up just in time to see one of her companions being seized by the end of the cycle. Its nightmarish appendage wrapped around the copy of Akira, and the creature focused all of its powers upon her. In an instant, the false Akira was utterly annihilated. Nothing remained of her at all. Both of the remaining doubles and the true Akira were all struck at once. A psionic rift opened between the attackers and the end of the cycle. The tear in reality was amplified by the Eater of Worlds, which projected itself into the battle via all three of the surviving combatants. The Great Terror's body began to warp and distort as the rift drew nearer and nearer to it. Blinded by fury, the end of the cycle seized the true Akira and both of her doubles and threw them towards the rift. Akira felt herself slide past the border of the tear, and her body was instantly racked with incredible pain. It was as though every fiber and nerve in her body was on fire. Akira, the true one, was caught in an unending torrent of agony. Desperate, panicking, Akira reached out with one hand and grabbed a fistful of psionic energy. Then she pulled back. Around her, Akira seemed to vaguely sense her two remaining doubles doing the same thing. All at once, reality was turned upside down and inside out. Colors became sounds, air and liquid, and the blood in Akira's veins were turned to white-hot plasma. The forces and sensations of reality being destroyed around her were just too much to handle, and Akira lost consciousness. Slowly, groggily, Akira woke up. She felt cold, the same kind of cold a person feels after stripping off a layer of clothing. Akira opened her eyes and found herself wishing she had died in her sleep. Her doubles were nowhere to be seen, and the end of the cycle was directly over her. With appendages that came straight out of the most graphic and disturbing of nightmares, the creature was peeling the shroud patrons off Akira's body in the same way it would have torn the flesh from her bones. The Eater of Worlds was the first to go, and as Akira felt her incredible strength being torn away, she rose up to try and fight back. But the end of the cycle applied the full force of its own being against her, pinning Akira in place. She struggled and screamed and cried as the instrument of desire and composer of strands were both violently torn away, depriving her of their powers. Then, just before the Whisperers in the Void were also seized, they gave Akira one final, desperate play. Fighting against the immense telepathic field holding her down, Akira pointed the Ven brace on her wrist towards the end of the cycle. A shaft of golden light shot out of the brace and struck the body of the cosmic horror, lighting it up in terrible relief. As soon as the connection was made, Akira poured all of her energies into it. It took all of her own willpower, but Akira finally managed to reverse the siphon. Psionic energy flowed in the opposite direction, out of the end of the cycle and into herself. Akira felt some of her powers being restored. All four of the Shroud patrons were lost, yet in those crucial seconds, she managed to outright steal several of their powers and abilities. Knowing that her deed would be discovered in a matter of seconds, Akira conjured a telekinetic force and severed her connection to the end of the cycle. The golden beam broke with a bright flash of light and a crack of tremendous thunder. For just a moment, the Great Terror shifted its attention to see what had caused the noise. In that instant, Akira sent a pulse of telekinesis into the ground below her. Akira shot up into the air in a violent, uncontrolled ascent. She twisted as her body fell, looking for the Archangel. It was still flying, caught in the hurricane of psionic forces churned up by the battle. As the end of the cycle rose to finish off Akira, she pulled herself through the shroud on a telekinetic tether, simultaneously summoning the space plane to herself. Akira just barely managed to catch her hands on the boarding ramp as the ship sailed by. With blood leaking from her fingers, Akira crawled up the ramp just as a bolt of dark energies hit the Angel. The spaceplane's armor sizzled, and a trail of acrid black smoke billowed out behind the ship as it flew one final orbit around the end of the cycle. As soon as the boarding ramp was closed behind Akira, she raced to the cockpit and activated the time core. As the yellow quantum wave front started to materialize in front of the Archangel, Akira nosed the space plane down into a dive. She set a collision course for the end of the cycle itself and pinned the throttle to the wall. This was it. No matter what happened next, the fight was over. The gargantuan monster reared up to its full height and enveloped the Archangel with its own power. Psionic energy permeated every corner of the ship, radiating out of every panel, computer screen, and button. Akira turned on the Ven brace one more time and started to siphon up as much of the end of the cycle's power as she could, channeling it all directly into her own body. With her new stolen powers, Akira played that final desperate hand. Less than a second before the Archangel would have collided with the end of the cycle, the quantum wavefront finally lurched backwards and swallowed the spaceplane. The shroud, the monster, and everything else vanished. At once, the ship's computer tried to abort the hyperspace jump and dropped the Archangel back into the shroud. "Warning," said the computer. "No valid destination selected. Abort jump. Abort. Abort." But Akira would not allow the Archangel to return to the shroud. She divided her attention. Standing upright in the cockpit, she pointed one hand towards the time core in the back and manipulated it with telekinesis. With the other, Akira reached out beyond the confines of the starship and extended her power into hyperspace itself, pulling the uncooperative vessel along. Leaving the shroud behind, Akira was using her stolen powers to forcefully tunnel her way through hyperspace by hand. She knew where she was and where she wanted to go, and since no path existed between the future and the past, she was going to make one. Using energies and powers stolen from the end of the cycle, the Whisperers in the Void, the Composer of Strands, the Eater of Worlds, and the Instrument of Desire, Akira bored her way through hyperspace and pulled the Archangel through the path she created. When she ran into impossible concepts in time and space, Akira forced them, against all logic and reason, to become possible. In her battle against nature and the very universe itself, Akira expended most of the powers she pilfered from the end of the cycle, but ultimately, she triumphed. The stream looped back upon itself, even though every law of physics and motion and gravity insisted that it should not have. The rules of quantum mechanics lay shattered at Akira's feet, and the Archangel was deposited in an empty black void by the waveform. For the first time since Akira didn't remember when, there was silence. But it only lasted for a moment. Before Akira could lower her arms or take a breath, a series of alarms went off all across the ship. Thermometers rose to such a high temperature that the displays failed. The outer skin of the spaceplane was so hot that steam was billowing out from behind the control panels and smoke rose from the cockpit floor. The metal walls of the fuselage grew hot to the touch and started to glow white. And before Akira could react, a brilliant white light shone through the blackout curtains, which had been knocked loose by the violent jump. The Archangel had rematerialized in the center of a newborn universe, less than 1 hour after the Big Bang had occurred. All of creation was expanding at incomprehensible speed, compact, and superheated. Realizing that the spaceplane would not survive in this ultra-hot environment, Akira desperately tried to punch her new command into the time core, but the controls were so hot that the buttons and keys were starting to melt. Sweat dripping down her face, Akira threw one last pulse of telekinesis into the time core, forcing a final jump. One last time, the quantum wavefront swept backwards and enveloped the ship. This time, the time jump went smoothly, and the Archangel instantly rematerialized. At once, the ship started to cool down. As the imminent danger passed, Akira stepped backwards, tripped, and fell over. Landing on her back in the rear of the cockpit, Akira looked down to discover that, in the intense heat of the dawning of the universe, her shoes had melted. That was when she realized she had succeeded. Akira was battered and bruised. She had lost all of her companions, as well as the 4 Shroud patrons, but she had still managed to take something of value. She still had the immense powers of the end of the cycle and its lesser 4 companions, safely stored inside of her own conscious mind. She had a fully functioning Venbrace, meaning that the capture and imprisonment of other psionic beings was still possible. And finally, she had accomplished the impossible. Akira had traveled into the past by visiting the end of the future. Lying exhausted on the floor, Akira began to laugh. Drunk with triumph, she laughed and laughed until she was hoarse. Then she stood up and realized that her encounter with a demonic god of destruction had left her completely spent. Akira stumbled back to the crew quarters and found her bunk. She took off the Venbrace and dropped it on the table. Then she collapsed into her bunk and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. After witnessing the creation of the universe, Akira slept for 7 days. Finally, after a week of resting, Akira woke up. She washed the blood and grime of battle off and dressed in a clean flight suit. Then she went to the cockpit and pulled the blackout curtain. She was so stunned by the beautiful sight in front of her that her breath caught in her throat. The Archangel had fallen into orbit around a cluster of newly formed stars. The universe was no longer in its chaotic infancy, but it was still very young. Nearly all of the stars were mind-numbingly gigantic in size and scale. In the distance, Akira could see a brilliant supernova marking the spot where one of the earliest stars in history had met its demise. No matter which direction Akira turned the ship to face, she could not see the galactic disk. Whatever time period she landed in, it clearly predated the creation of her home galaxy. Akira put her hands on the Time Core control panel and was about to start typing in a destination when she hesitated. Now that she was here, that she had actually arrived in the past, she found that she'd briefly forgotten where to start, what to do. She laughed at herself for a moment, then opened up one of the drawers in the wall next to the pilot's seat. Akira retrieved one of the tablet computers that had her list of historical events to change. Akira knew what she wanted to do, what she had to do. She would create a new timeline, one in which the world was a better place for herself and for her family too. She resolved to at least try and honor Asuna's final wish. But most importantly of all, Akira would make a perfect future for herself. One where she would spend the rest of her life in peace, without fear of ever being disturbed again. Flicking through the data on her screen, Akira stared long and hard at her new ultimate goal. On the tablet was a map of the galaxy, which showed one whole galactic arm under the control of the Empire of Men, while all remaining spaceborne civilizations would be subjugated by humankind as vassals, client states, or puppets. In the center of it all, the Earth would be insulated from all external threats for hundreds, if not thousands of years. A psionic army would maintain peace and order on Earth itself, doubly ensuring the peace and preemptively neutralizing anyone who would so much as dare to think about upending the order of things. Once this future was established, there would never be any conflict or violence anywhere in the galaxy again. There would only be peace and order. Full of determination and resolve, Akira keyed her first destination into the computer and initiated a time jump. it was time to get started. This is Macavity 116. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of All Our Sins Remembered, narrated by the author. This work is copyrighted 2021 by Macavity 116. Stellaris is the property of Paradox Interactive. Homeworld was originally developed by Relic Entertainment and Sierra Studios and is presently owned by Gearbox Software. XCOM is owned by Take-Two Interactive and developed by Firaxis Games. The central characters of this story, namely Akira Robinson, her family, and her friends, were created by Macavity 116. Copyright 2015.